This video is sponsored by Surfshark. In this tutorial, I'm gonna show you how to twist text in basically anything you want inside of After Effects, but I'm also gonna show you how to do it inside of Cinema 4D Lite because it's bundled with After Effects. You already have access to it, it produces better results, it has better controls, and it even renders more quickly, so there's no reason for you not to be using Cinema 4D Lite. Let's jump right in. For this first technique, we're gonna be sticking in After Effects, and I kind of feel like there's some secrecy involved with these cool text animations that you see online, and I don't want any technique in After Effects to remain a secret. I want you to be able to create whatever you want to create, but what I do want to keep a secret is what I got my family for Christmas this year. Fortunately, there's a really effective way of doing that with this video's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Besides keeping your personal data private and secure from cyber criminals or virtually changing your location to access blocked content in your area, Surfshark VPN can keep you safe from nosy family members who try to find out what they're gonna get for Christmas. As a dad and past child, I know exactly how hard kids try to find out what Santa's gonna bring them for Christmas. Now in my house, I've worked out a deal with Santa. He gets to bring one present for each of my kids, but the rest of the credit goes to mom and dad. Speaking of mom, since I do 99% of my shopping online, I don't want her accidentally stumbling on my order or search history or seeing targeted ads for products that I've shopped for. And that's why the secret to keeping secrets and making surprises without surprises is using Surfshark VPN to keep all of that online shopping under the radar. And just to throw them off the trail, you can temporarily disable the VPN and search for completely random off-the-wall items that, if discovered, will just confuse them and keep your secrets safe. Just don't forget to re-enable that VPN once you're finished. So start gift shopping today with the 24-month VPN plan from Surfshark. Right now, Surfshark has a great offer, 3 extra months for free plus 85% off your order. This offer is only good through December 31st of this year, so don't miss it. By the way, it's available for all of your devices and has a 30-day money-back guarantee. Just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description and use my promo code MOTION. Your gift ideas are safe with Surfshark. Thanks so much to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. All right, so here in After Effects, we need something to distort, and really it can be whatever you want, but I'm gonna use some text as an example. So I'm just gonna type out the word Twisty in this nice big bold font called Transducer. This is available on Adobe Fonts, but I'm gonna align that to the center of my composition with the Align panel. And the next thing I wanna do is pre-compose this layer. This will be the source comp. Whatever we put into this is what's going to get distortion applied to it. So with that layer selected, I'll press Control-Shift-C or Command-Shift-C on a Mac, and I'll just rename this Twisted Source. So I know that's my source comp and click OK. And this particular animation, I want to look like it's rotating in 3D space, getting twisted as it's rotating and then rotate it off again. So to do that, I'm actually going to rotate it all around in 3D space using 4 different sides. So it's like this long rectangle block of text that's actually rotating. So to do that quickly and efficiently, I'm just gonna enable the 3D switch right there for this pre-comp, duplicate it, and before I duplicate it anymore, rotate it backwards by clicking and dragging with my selection tool on this red rotation axis gizmo, and then just hold Shift to snap that in 45-degree increments. I wanna go back 90 degrees. So now I have one facing the camera and one that's parallel or perpendicular, to the camera. And what I wanna do now is tie these two together with the anchor points. So I'm gonna press A to bring up the anchor points of both, use the property pick whip and click and drag that to the original anchor point. So now, whatever this anchor point is, this one's going to adopt it as well. And that's gonna be important in a second. But before we get there, let's duplicate this one more time, rotate it again on the X-axis, -90 degrees, duplicate one more time, and then click and drag and rotate one more time, -90 degrees. Now I have 4 instances of this layer. They're all tied to the original anchor point and they're all rotated incrementally by 90 degrees. So what I can do now is grab the Z-axis of that anchor point property, click and drag it, and as I do that, all the anchor points are going to adjust at the same time, and I can push them out to where the top and bottom layers are beyond the height of the text, so that I'm kind of getting this block now, this long rectangle with 4 sides that all have my source comp inside of them. Now, obviously I can see through each one of these sides. I don't want that to be the case, so I'm just gonna jump back into this pre-comp and I'm gonna make a new rectangle by double clicking on the rectangle tool, no other layers selected, and that makes a rectangle the size of the comp. But I don't want it to be the entire size of the comp because if I go back here, that's gonna fill the entire comp and I just want it to basically go to the bounds of that layer. So I made this 146 pixels on the anchor point. Why don't we just say 140 to be a little bit more round of a number? Go back in here and that's the size that I wanna make this rectangle. So I'll double tap the U key to bring up the modified properties and adjust this size. So I need to unlink the width and the height and change the height to 140. Except that's actually not the right size. It needs to be double that because the anchor point is only pushing it out 140 pixels in one dimension. I need to double that to go in both dimensions, so that's gonna be 280, or I could just say times 2, and that'll do the math for me. So now I have a rectangle serving as the background, so I'll rename that BG, and that should fill in all of the transparency that we had in this main comp, and now I can just parent all of these layers. If I select all of them with Controller Command A and then use my parent pick whip to grab that first layer, why don't we name this leader? I can rotate that and all of these layers are gonna rotate with it and it now looks like a 3D rectangle. So that's really cool. That's exactly what I needed to hide all that transparency and give this convincing 3D look. All right, so I'm gonna press R to bring up the rotation, and that was actually affecting the orientation. I wanna now add in some keyframes, but not on the orientation. So I'm gonna reset that back down to 0, and we're gonna use the X rotation to animate this. So all I need to do is set a keyframe here on the X rotation on the first frame of my comp, go forward maybe, let's say 2 seconds, and increase the cycles 1 revolution. So it's gonna go 360 degrees all the way around in a positive direction. If I play that back, this is what it looks like. So nothing too complicated, but now that that's done, we're gonna start twisting this with distortion using the time displacement effect. If you wanna know all the intricate little details about how this effect works, you can go check out my Effects of After Effects video, click on the card above to watch exactly what this effect does and how it works. I'm gonna go a little bit more quickly in this tutorial just so we can get through it all, but I'm again going to double click on the rectangle tool with no layers selected, and I'll call this time map, and I wanna change my fill from being a solid to being a gradient. So I'm gonna say linear gradient as the type, click OK, and then just jump into that gradient and change this to just a 2-color gradient from black to white, and click OK. And then I wanna move these handles over to the right while holding Shift, and then grab this one, move it over to the left, and I need this to be very precise, starting and ending on both edges of the comp. So I'm gonna go into the rectangle shape group, into the gradient fill, and find my start and end points for that gradient. Looks like I nailed the start point, that's -960, right on the edge of the comp there. On the end point, that needs to be +960. And now I know I have a full linear gradient going from black to white, and I can reverse this if I need to, but we'll just call that time map and move that to the base of the comp. I don't actually need to see it anymore. What I do need to do is make an adjustment layer. So I'm gonna come up to Layer, New, Adjustment Layer, and I'll call this Time Displacement, and then search for the time displacement effect. Time displace, there we go. Apply that to the adjustment layer, and by default, it's going to use its own layer as the source. That's not what I want though. I want it to be the time map. So under time displacement layer, change that to time map, and already we're getting something really interesting. If I scrub through this, it takes a little bit of time to render, but we're getting this twisted distortion, which is kind of what we're wanting. Let me jump back to the start of the comp, and I need to point something out. Because of the way that this effect works, we're starting to see distortion before we want it to, and that's because white and black values are mapped to positive and negative times. What this effect is doing is looking at this map, taking the brightness values of that map and then translating that to time offsets based on the placement of the pixels that make up that gradient. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around, but it should make sense once we start to modify it here. Everything from 50% gray up to the white values is looking forward in time, and the darker values are looking backwards in time. And to make this even easier to visualize, I'm going to apply another effect to this gradient. So I'm just gonna search for the posterize effect, and this will allow me to basically change the number of levels of gradient we're actually getting. This isn't actually affecting the time displacement yet. I need to go to the effect and tell the time displacement layer to also respect the effects that I've applied. So I'm gonna do that by choosing effects and masks. And when I do that, now it's a lot easier to visualize because I'm basically turning the resolution of this time displacement down even further. So if we zoom in, you can see that each band of this gradient going from white to black is offsetting the contents of this pre-comp, everything underneath this adjustment layer in time. And if I go to my posterized levels and I increase that, the more levels there are of black to white, brightness levels, the higher the resolution of the time displacement there actually is. So hopefully that gives you a good visualization of how this effect is actually doing this distortion. All right, let's get back to the start of the comp and I'll get rid of posterize. So since nothing is happening before the start of the comp, we're not getting any distortion at the start of the comp. And since I don't want this distortion to happen until the comp has already started playing back, I actually need to remap my gradient values. So I'm gonna go back into that gradient editor, and instead of using pure white on this end, I'm gonna change the brightness value down to 50%. And already, without even applying this, you can see that my distortion has disappeared. So let me click OK and then just play this back, and you'll see now that distortion is passing through my text. And it looks exactly the way that I wanted it to. That gives that twisty effect that I'm after, but it's obviously very segmented. Look at all of that blockiness. That's not exactly the look that I'm after. And what we can do to smooth that out a little bit is going into the effect controls. So let's zoom in nice and close and go to the time displacement effect and take a look at the time resolution. This is set to 60 FPS. I can increase this to 120. It'll take a little bit longer to process, but after it's done, you see that those chunks basically got a little bit closer together. Now, I'm not gonna lie to you, this is a very slow to render effect, and it is kind of difficult to get good looking results. But one way to get better results is to go to your project settings. Down here, you see I'm working in 8 bits per channel. If you alt or option click on this value, it's going to change to 16 bits per channel. And that's basically going to give you much more color depth in your scene, which allows you to have many more brightness values in your gradient. And this effect can take advantage of that. So if I change my time resolution up to say 960, just go really high. Again, this is gonna take longer to render. Now I edited it out, but down here you can see the frame render time was 34 seconds. Yes, it looks extremely smooth compared to what it was, but man, that's a long time to render one frame. If I play this back now, it has processed it and it doesn't take quite as long to do every single frame. So if I just pause right here, you see it's taking on average 3.5 seconds per frame now. So it's not the worst way to do this, but it definitely takes a lot of time to process, and it still doesn't give you the cleanest, crispest results possible. There is some distortion in there still. But as you can see, it does give you some pretty good results. So if you absolutely have to stay in After Effects, this is a decent way to pull off this look. Now, I don't want this map visible in the background, obviously. But as you can see, every time you change something, it's going to have to reprocess basically the entire range of motion. So be aware of that. This is a very slow process, and I would not crank up this value. In fact, I wouldn't even work in 16 bits per channel until you're ready to render, because it just goes so much quicker if I change this back down to 8 bits per channel and turn my samples back down to say 60. Then we're working with a lower resolution of time displacement, but you can see how much more quickly this is rendering. So if I turn my black background back on, it looks like just the text now is twisting, but here's what you can do now that we have this set up. If I just press U to bring up the keyframes, I can ease them by just pressing the F9 key with them selected, go into my graph editor and just ease this out with the speed graph so it's a little bit more extreme. And again, let that reprocess, but then preview it, and that's gonna have a dramatic effect on how the twisted animation plays out through all this time displacement. And we can adjust how long this time displacement offset actually takes. So right now it's going at a rate of 1 second, but if I go into the time displacement effect, I can change that max displacement from 1 second down to say half a second. If I say 0.5, now it's gonna happen a little bit more quickly. Or if I said 0.25, it'll go even more quickly. It's more uniform, I should say. Not necessarily a speed thing, but you see it's twisting less. If I increase this up to 2, it's gonna have a much tighter twist, and the start and end are going to be basically still for longer. So you can play around with this value to get whatever you like. I think that half-second twist looks pretty good. And we can even take this one step further and add in a little bit of anticipation and overshoot with our keyframes. Let me just turn off the time displacement for a second so this renders quickly. But what I want to do is add another keyframe at the start. You saw I shifted these 2 keyframes forward in time. Instead of going straight into that rotation, I want to rotate it back a little bit. So I'm going to go to the second keyframe, rotate it in the opposite direction, maybe 14 degrees, why not, before it moves forward. And then once it gets to the last keyframe, what I want to do is have it overshoot. So let me go back just a little bit and add another keyframe right here. Actually, let me copy and paste this keyframe and I'll rotate it forward. So let me just go forward maybe about 20 degrees. And that way it's going to first rotate back, anticipating the motion that's about to happen. Then it will rotate forward a bunch and then overshoot where it's going to land and then come back to that resting point. Now I need to go into my speed graph and adjust these curves a little bit to get something a little more smooth. And I might need to retime it a little bit. So let's just space these keyframes out a little bit more so it has more time to come to a rest at the end. But let's play this back and see what it looks like without the distortion at first. So it anticipates, spins, overshoots, and then comes to a rest. That that looks good. Now let's see what that does to the time displaced version. So I'll re-enable that, let it preview, and then we'll view it as a whole. So there you go. You see, it gives it a little bit more personality. This is something that you can play around with endlessly. However you animate the source is going to change how the time displacement actually ends up looking. And then playing around with these other settings within the effect as well will change that final look of the animation. And remember, whatever you put into this source comp is going to be updated in the main comp. So you could change the text to say something else. You could put photos in here, video, animations, other pre-comps, whatever you want, and it will all link up to this source pre-comp. The only thing you might need to change is if the height of your text changes, then you'll have to change the actual anchor point for that leader layer so that this is spaced out appropriately for whatever you have within the pre-comp. And also just remember to make sure this rectangle size is filling out the background at a height value double to what this anchor point is, so that it mats off these other layers. Now, if you want transparency, if you want to be able to see through where this black is, but you still want to maintain that matting that's going on, what you could do is, again, pre-compose all of these. So I'll press Control-Shift-C and then just give it a name. I'll call this 3D block, and then click OK. And apply the extract effect. If we search for that over here in the effects and presets, I'll just apply that keying effect to my pre-comp and then just bring up the black pretty far by clicking and dragging on this top left corner square and then grabbing the bottom left one and dragging that back towards the left. Doesn't have to go all the way, but basically what this is doing is removing all of the black pixels, but with this fall off that's a little bit more soft than if we were to just clip it off completely. But now what this allows us to do is fill this with whatever color we want. It still maintains all of the matting of the pre-comps, but what this allows us to do is now composite this into anything else or on top of anything else while maintaining control of, say, the fill color. If I applied the fill effect, I could change this to any other color and keep all of that original matting while still giving me the ability to composite this on top of any other comps. And of course, once you're happy with the animation, go ahead and increase your bits per channel up to 16 bits and maybe go into the time displacement and increase this. It doesn't have to go up to 960, maybe we'll say 480 and see if that gives us a smooth enough result. Basically, you should be working with as low of a time resolution as you possibly can without sacrificing quality. This is definitely one of those effects that you need to get in there and just experiment with and change the animation to see how you can come up with your own unique distortions. I'm only rotating this on one axis. You can obviously rotate it on any axis. Play around with the scale though, the colors, see what else you can do to come up with unique looking deformations. By the way, if you want to support more tutorials like this one, then please consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. You can click the card above to follow the link to go there. Thank you so much to all of the patrons who are already supporting me. It's a huge help to be able to make more content here on YouTube. All right, now let's take a look at the Cinema 4D version of this same effect. And I'm gonna be using the light version of Cinema 4D because it's bundled with After Effects. You don't need any extra licenses other than your Creative Cloud subscription that you already have. You can use Cinema 4D Lite directly in After Effects and it actually renders really quickly. And the only real way to get into Cinema 4D Lite is by opening After Effects, going to File, down to New, and saying Max on Cinema 4D File. When you click on that, it's going to ask you where you want to save this file because it has to create it. So I'm just gonna stick mine on the desktop. I'll call this Twisty and click Save, and then it's going to open up Cinema 4D Lite. Now, I'm not gonna go in depth into Cinema 4D Lite, but I will try to do every step that I can to help you along the way if this is your first time using it. I don't want you to be afraid of it. I want you to get in here and see why Cinema 4D is so much better of a tool for 3D than After Effects is. So I don't need this little quick start dialog, so I'll just close that out. This is the project that we just created in After Effects. You see it's called Twisty.c4d. Whatever I put in here is going to show up in After Effects. So if I were to make a cube and I hit save and then jumped into After Effects, this Cinema 4D file that I have in the project panel, I can click and drag down to the new comp button, and once it loads, it will be displayed right here in After Effects using the Cineware effect that is the bridge between After Effects and Cinema 4D. All right, so let's jump back into Cinema 4D. I don't actually need that cube, so I'm gonna select it and press delete. What I do need to do is basically recreate that same 4-face 3D rectangle that we created in After Effects using 4 different planes. So I'm gonna hold down on this cube right here. This is where we can get to all of our primitive shapes. Kind of think of these like the shape layer tools in After Effects. And I want 4 planes. So while clicking and dragging on that cube, I'm just gonna hover over plane and let go. Now this is facing up. If you imagine this as a 3D space, you can see that 3D grid. It is flat on the ground right now and I want it to face the camera. To do that, I'm gonna come down to my attributes and I'm going to change it from the plus Y orientation to the minus Z orientation. And now it's kind of facing in the distance. So you can click and drag on this little rotation up here to orbit around the 3D scene and zoom in and out as well as pan. So just click and drag on these three. And then there's this fourth button here. When you click on that, this is the 4-up view. So I can see my perspective, top, right, and front views all at once. I'm gonna utilize all 4 of these views to make my rectangle. And you might be wondering, why am I not just making a cube? Since it already has all the sides on it, I could change the size to be whatever I want. Well, it's because of the way that we're going to apply textures. I need to be able to control how that texture is displayed on each face of the geometry, and I can't control that with a primitive shape. And with Cinema 4D Lite, I don't have any access to the modeling tool. So to keep this as simple as possible, we're basically going to do the exact same thing we did in After Effects. Make 4 different planes and then rotate them around in 3D space to make a 3D box. So with my plane selected, I'm going to come down to the width and the height. Now, these are measured in centimeters currently. The units is centimeters, but the units really don't matter since it's a 3D program. It can be whatever we want. So I'm gonna work thinking in terms of pixels. And if I jump back to After Effects and we take a look at that twisted source comp, why don't we just stick with this for now? Remember this rectangle, if I double tap the U key, is 1920 by 280. So I can adopt these values into centimeters in Cinema 4D and it won't matter because the ratio is really all that matters. So I'll type in 1920 on the width and 280 on the height. And now I have a rectangle that's the same ratio as the rectangle that I have as this shape layer here in After Effects. Now I need to get this text into Cinema 4D, and this is one of the cons of this technique is that we have to actually export an image out of After Effects in order to use inside of Cinema 4D. There's no way to dynamically link a pre-comp from After Effects into a material in Cinema 4D. But I think the benefits of Cinema 4D outweigh the cost of exporting this texture. So I'm gonna start by just resizing this composition to be the size of that rectangle, 280 pixels tall. So I'll go up to composition settings, and say 280 pixels on the height. And now that's gonna fit my texture just fine. What I wanna do now is export this as a still image. So I'm gonna come up to composition, say save frame as and file, and that will add that comp to the render queue with the output module defaulting to Photoshop. I don't want a Photoshop file, I want a PNG. So I'm gonna click on the word Photoshop, and I'm gonna go to the format and change it to PNG. So there's PNG sequence. Don't worry about it saying sequence. I don't need a sequence, I just need one still image. Everything else should be fine though. I'll click OK. And because we have this set to current settings, because I went to composition, save frame as, the render settings were changed to only export the one frame that I had selected. So that's a little neat trick. If you're ever on a single frame and you only wanna export that frame, go to composition, save frame as, and it will automatically isolate just to that one frame. Now, if you wanted to distort something in Cinema 4D that wasn't static, you could export a PNG sequence and load that in, but that's something for another tutorial. We're gonna stick to this static text image for this tutorial. So I'm just gonna stick this on my desktop, hit render, that'll export, and now I can jump back into Cinema 4D, make a new material by coming up to this material manager button right here. Click on that once, and then click on this plus to add a new default material. Next, I want to double click on that material and change its properties. So I don't need color, I'll uncheck that, and I don't need reflectance because none of the 3D properties of Cinema 4D are really going to be applied other than the actual geometry. So what I want to check on is the luminance. This way there's no lighting being involved, it's just gonna put this texture, whatever I load in here, flat on that geometry. No lighting from Cinema 4D is gonna modify it at all. So with that luminance selected, I'll come over to the texture and click on this little folder icon. And this allows me to navigate to wherever my texture is. So there's my twisted source pre-comp that I exported as an image. I'll select that and click open. And now that that's loaded into the material, I can close out of it and click and drag that material onto the plane. And that text is aligned because the ratio of the resolution of the texture matches the ratio of my geometry. It's not distorted at all, and I can be sure of that. So I'll just close up my material manager. I now have that plane with the material applied, and I can start building my box. To do that, I first want to bring it forward in Z space. So just like in After Effects, I can click and drag on this handle with my selection tool, my move tool active, and just move it around in 3D space. I could also do that from my top view here, and that's just a different view of the same movement. Now I want to move this a specific amount. Remember, the height is 280 units, in this case centimeters, but if I jump over to the coordinates tab, I want to move this forward half of that value. So 140, but it's actually in the negative direction on the Z-axis. So with the Z-axis selected, I'm going to type negative 140 and press enter. And now I know it's snapped to that 140, half of the height value. And I can now duplicate and rotate this just like it did in After Effects, except I need to rotate it from the center of this scene, and my anchor point for this primitive plane layer can't be modified. So what I need to do is make a new null object, which is this button right up here. I'll just click on it once, and that makes a null right in the center of my scene. And to use that as the parent of this plane, I'll just click and drag the plane on top of it, and now it's a child of that null object, which allows me to do whatever I want. So I could rotate this around the center of the scene freely now. Now I undid that with Control Z because I didn't actually want to rotate it yet, but what I do want to do is duplicate this 3 more times. And to duplicate something in Cinema 4D, in the Object Manager, just hold down Controller Command, click and drag until you see that arrow, and I'll let go, and that made a duplicate of it. So what I can do now is jump back into this perspective view by clicking on that 4-up button again, click and drag on that red Y-axis rotation, just like in After Effects. Hold Shift to snap it into 5-degree increments this time, but I want to go back negative 90 degrees. And then I'll actually select both of these nulls just by clicking on one, holding Control or Command and clicking on the next, and then again, Control, click and drag upwards, and now I have 2 more copies of this. I'll actually rotate this around a little bit, and then click and drag on that red Y rotation one more time while holding Shift. So it's 180 degrees this time, and I've completed my 3D box that's all made up of these planes with the text all being displayed properly. Now that that's set up, I need to make a camera that's facing this straight on so that it looks the way that I want it to when I bring it back into After Effects. So I'm going to come down my toolbar here and get to the camera, the standard camera, and just click on it once. That adds a camera to the scene. I'm going to make sure that I'm viewing through that camera by clicking on this target right here, and then come down to the transform properties for this camera and zero some of them out. So on the X, I want that to be 0. On the Y, I want that to be 0. And for the rotation, I want those to be zeroed out as well. So the camera is centered in my scene on the X and Y and looking straight ahead. Now this actually looks just fine, but I would like to have no perspective on this camera, and that's something we can do in Cinema 4D. So I'm going to come over to the Object tab with that camera selected, and under Projection, change it from Perspective to Parallel. And that's going to zoom in a little bit, but what I can do is just click and drag on this button right here to kind of zoom back out and fit that within the frame a little bit so that I'm touching the edges of that texture of my entire geometry, and it's nice and framed. Now, one thing we haven't looked at yet is the resolution of this project file. If I click on this button right here, the render settings, this is going to be where I can say what the output should be. And it's currently 1280 by 720. That's not what I want. I want it to be 1920 by 1080. So I'm just going to type those numbers in and press enter, and nothing has changed in my scene really because it's all relative to what Cinema 4D is going to output. The ratio is the same, so my camera hasn't changed at all. One thing you might notice is how fuzzy this texture looks, and this is something else we can actually modify. So let's open up our Material Manager one more time, double click on that material, come down to Viewport, and up to Texture Preview Size. The default is very low resolution, but this is just a preview. Let's just push this up to say 2048 by 2048, and now it's nice and crisp. All right, with that done, I'll close that out, collapse the Material Manager, and now let's look at how we could actually distort this. I'll switch back to my 4-up view by clicking on this button right here. And what I want to do is actually put all of these null objects within one more null, kind of thinking of this like pre-comping. So let me collapse all of these null objects up, make one more, and then grab all of these and drag it in there. And I'll just rename this first null by double clicking on it, and we'll call this control. Now that everything else is grouped underneath this null object, I can use Cinema 4D's deformers in this menu right here to actually deform the geometry that's within that null object. The one deformer that I'm concerned with is the twist deformers. So while clicking and holding on that deformers menu, I'll go down to twist and let go. That adds a twist deformer to my scene, but it doesn't do anything yet because it needs to exist in the same group as the geometry that I actually want to distort. So I need to drag that down below all these other null objects, but making sure I go into the control null. So right here, not there. You can see the difference between that highlighted line. This is in that null objects group. This is outside of it. So I want to go right in there. And now I can actually distort anything in this group by clicking and dragging on this slider right here. And obviously that's not twisting in the correct direction, so I need to reorient it a little bit. So I'm gonna switch to my rotation tool by pressing R on the keyboard. And from my front view, I'm going to click and drag anywhere in this comp outside of that center area and hold Shift so that I know I can snap to 90 degrees right there. And now it's twisting in the right direction, but it's really, really tight. You can see in every view here, that's a really tight twist. So what I want to do is, again, click on that twist deformer and go to the size. Now, remember I just rotated this, so the width is actually the y-axis, the height of this deformer, since it's now on its side. So I'm gonna click and drag that, and in fact, I'm going to just type in the number 1920, since that's the width of the geometry. And now if I zoom out on some of these, you can see that the deformer is the same width as my box. Now the height and depth don't really matter, but if you want to be consistent, we could make these 280 as well, and it will fit the geometry perfectly now. And what's really cool about this deformer is the way that it bends is super smooth right from the get-go. And if I click on this 4-up view for my parallel final view and press Controller Command R, that will render the frame, and you can see that that distortion is nice and smooth. But if you ever feel like you're not getting enough resolution out of this distortion, you can always go into your planes, just control click on each one of them, and come up to the width segments and increase this value. So if I change my display to say lines so we can see all of the texturing, and I just turn off my twist for a second, I can increase the width to add much more geometry to these planes, and that gives the twist deformer more geometry to work with and warp. Most of the time, you don't see any kind of issues with the way that this deformer works, but if you need to, you can bump that up, and it really doesn't take much longer at all to render. All right, I'm gonna save this and jump back into After Effects and just take a look at what that looks like in the comp. So we've got the Twisty pre-comp, and why don't we just rename this Twisty C4D just to make it easy to understand. And this does support transparency. There we see that we have that if I turn the transparency grid on. Under the effect controls, under the Cineware effect, I'm gonna change the renderer from viewport draft to current, and that just basically means the final rendered version of this project file from Cinema 4D. So this is what it's going to look like in the end in here in After Effects. But now that we see that's working out, I'm gonna jump back into Cinema 4D and let's actually animate this twist. And if you've only ever animated inside of After Effects, then keyframing and animating inside of Cinema 4D is gonna seem very strange at first, but it actually has a really fantastic way of animating things. What I want to do is animate this twist property, but I also want to animate the rotation of this control null, which would be this y-axis right here. And I want to make sure that I'm working in the same frame rate as what I want to be in the end. So by default, if I press Control D in Cinema 4D, that will bring up my project settings, and my frames per second is defaulted to 30. And if I go into my render settings, that's going to reflect the same thing. But I can change those two things independently. Just make sure whatever frame rate you want to work in is showing up in both the render settings and the project settings so that your keyframes don't have any issues. Now, I was working in 24 frames per second in After Effects, but 30 frames per second, that's just fine. So I'm going to leave it as is. And at the start of my scene, I'm going to add a keyframe on the angle, but I'm going to change this down to 0 first. So the way to add a keyframe is to find that keyframe button, the diamond shape that we're already familiar with, and click on it. So that adds a keyframe. Unlike After Effects though, it's not going to automatically update if I go forward in time and change this number. It's not going to set that second keyframe until I click on that button again. There is an auto keyframing system in Cinema 4D, but we don't need to get into that for this tutorial. So let me just undo back to where we have this first keyframe on the twist value for the first frame. And then I also want to go into the control null, into the coordinates, and on this rotation P for pitch, I think is what that P stands for, that's what I want to set a keyframe on. So I'll click on that keyframe as well, and now I can go forward in time. So why don't we just say it takes about 2 seconds to get through the entire twist. So I'll go to frame 60, I'll rotate this forward, let's say 270 degrees. So that's 3 turns, 1, 2, 3 faces forward, and then click on that keyframe one more time to add a keyframe. As you can see, this is now animating between the two, and it's automatically easy eased those keyframes. So you get easy ease by default in Cinema 4D. But I also want this geometry to be twisting. So maybe we go forward about 15 frames, go to the twist deformer into the object settings, and increase this angle to twist it. Now actually, this is twisting in the opposite direction I want it to, so I need to click and drag to a negative value on this number here so that it's twisting in the opposite direction. So why don't we say a value of about maybe negative 45 degrees and click on that keyframe. So now it's going to rotate and twist at the same time, and then maybe around, say, frame 45, we set another keyframe for it at that same value, and then come to that resting point of 60 frames and change this back down to 0. And again, set one last keyframe. And if I play this back, we're gonna get something that was very similar to what we had inside of After Effects, but I think that we can push this a little bit further, modify the easing of these keyframes, and work in a little bit of that anticipation and overshoot. So what I wanna do is see a better view of my timeline and my keyframes, and the way we do that in Cinema 4D is by going up to Window and down to Timeline, Dope Sheet, or F-Curve. Those are kind of funny names, but Timeline is what we want. So I'm gonna click on that. Mine is docked down here, so I'm just gonna click and drag this to make it a little bit bigger, but now I can scrub through this and see my keyframes a little bit more easily. Now they're all grouped underneath this control null. I need to expand this out to be able to see the rotation and twist keyframes individually. But first I want to disable the twist deformer. If I just click on that green check mark, it'll disable it. That way I can work on the timing before I add in the deformation from that twist deformer. So let's just play this back and we'll see the timing, all right? So it takes a good amount of time, 60 frames, 2 seconds. That's a pretty long time, but when we add in the anticipation and overshoot, that might change the pace. So let's open up the rotation so we can see that red axis keyframe right there and hold down Control or Command while clicking and dragging to duplicate this keyframe. So I'm gonna move it forward maybe, I don't know, 10 frames, and then I can just double click on this value to edit it. So I wanna make this maybe a value of negative, say 20. Remember, that's gonna rotate it back 20 degrees now, so that might be a little bit too much, but let's just play that. And we can see now it's anticipating before going forward. And then let's just duplicate this keyframe as well, Control or Command click and drag it back to about maybe this 45 frame mark. And I want this to go forward past 270. So let's double click on that value and say 300, so that's 30 degrees past, and play that back. So because of all the default easing, if I play this back, it's all pretty smooth so far, but I wanna make that even smoother, and to do that, I'm gonna jump into my F-curve, which is like the value graph in After Effects. You can click on this button right here to switch to it, or press the Tab key, and because that property was selected, that's what I'm seeing in here. What I wanna do is just ease this curve. As you can see, like I said, it does look just like the value graph, but you do need to know how to navigate it. It doesn't automatically snap into view like After Effects does. So the way that you can navigate around this is, again, with these little pan and zoom in and out buttons right here. Just click and drag. You can also use the keyboard shortcuts of 1. Just hold down the 1 key, click and drag to pan, and 2, click and drag to zoom in and out on that Y-axis. But with all of this in view, I'm just gonna select this keyframe by dragging a box around it and then click and drag on this handle to modify it. Now this is gonna behave differently than it does in After Effects. So you can see that this is adjusting the width of both handles attached to this keyframe, but it's also not locking to that horizontal position. So one, I need to hold down Shift so that I'm only modifying the handle that I grabbed, and I also need to hold down Control to lock that to the perfectly horizontal position. With that done, I can ease this out really strongly, let go of my mouse, and then let go of the keyboard buttons, then select this key and do the same thing. Click, hold Control, hold Shift, and drag this out to the left to be much more strongly eased. And if I play this back, now we have this animation that goes a little bit more strong on that ease. And I think that's actually really good timing. It's simple, but it looks pretty nice. Now all I need to do is turn that twist deformer back on and modify the timing of those keyframes to get something that lines up a little bit better. So let's grab that twist and actually just press Tab, jump back into this dope sheet view. And I'll stop the animation and go back to the first frame. So for this twist property, I need to have it start twisting basically at the same time as the rotation of the control, just in the opposite direction. So we went negative 20 degrees backwards in the rotation. So I'm gonna grab this twist and bring it to that same point in time and change its value from 45 to negative 20. That's less of a distortion now, but it's in sync and counteracting the rotation of the actual geometry. So we're twisting it basically on one end without doing much to the other end, this left edge. So just the right edge is twisting right now before it begins to spin. And that looks good for the start of the animation, but that twist is actually leading the rest of the animation. And I'd rather it kind of stay there and let the right edge start this wave of twisting and let it gradually get to that point. So what I think I need to do is go forward in time to about here and then add another value. So I'll control click or drag that angle value and just change it to something else, maybe positive 20, and see if that helps counteract the twisting movement and basically flipping what gets to lead the twist. And that's actually making me realize that this third keyframe should be going in the opposite direction, not negative 45, but maybe a value of 45. Or really whatever value this is past that 90-degree increment, which remember it ends at 270 and we went 30 degrees beyond that for the overshoot, so it's a value of 30. So I could change this to 30 on the distortion to counteract that final twist. So let's play this back and see what it looks like. And I'll click off of this so we don't see as many overlays. And that's actually working pretty well. So we've got the initial twist from the start, leading the animation, and then the final counteracting twist at the end. So these are all working together nicely now, and I could probably push this twist angle even further right here. So maybe instead of 20, I say something like 60 or even 90 and get a much more dramatic twist. Now I'm going to need to play around with the timing of that a little bit more. Maybe this should happen right around the 30 frame mark so that when the entire geometry is rotating at the fastest rate, that's when we get the max twist in our animation. But it's all very fluid, very dynamic looking. And if I go into the F curve by pressing the tab key on the keyboard, I can modify this curve even further. So maybe it's getting a little ahead of itself right here. I'll ease more strongly out of this one, again holding Control and Shift just to modify the outgoing velocity of that keyframe. But that takes care of the smoothness over here on the left edge, syncing up the twist with the rotation, and makes for something that looks really nice and fluid. Now, looking at the F curve, it doesn't seem like I really need this keyframe. If I just delete it, that'll probably simplify things a little bit. Maybe I could ease out of this one a little more strongly. Same thing right here. But now I have less keyframes to deal with for making this same animation. I think that looks pretty good, so I'm gonna save this. I'm gonna stop the playback and jump back into After Effects, and right away I can preview this in After Effects, and you see that it does not take that much time to render at all because the standard renderer in Cinema 4D is very quick to render when you're not using any kind of lights or anything. This is just flat geometry with flat textures using that luminance channel, so no lighting is influencing the rendering process of this at all. So it's clearly much quicker to render than the time displacement technique inside of After Effects natively. It also, in my opinion, produces much smoother results. If I zoom in, you can see it's all anti-aliased, but it's done in a very nice, smooth way versus the time displacement, which only has as much resolution as you're able to give it with the brightness values of a gradient. I don't need to be in 16 bits per channel for this to work. I could drop this back down to 8 bits per channel, and that's just gonna help it render even more quickly. But we're now getting a very similar look in Cinema 4D Lite, dynamically linked into After Effects, and we can treat this just like any other piece of footage. So I could take this Twisty C4D comp, put it into another one, and I'll call this Twisty Color. And we'll use the same process as we did before. With my transparency grid enabled, you can see the black bar. I'll just take that extract effect, apply it to the layer, bring this little square over to the right, drag this one back to the left, add the fill effect, so I can change the color of this to be whatever I want. Let's just choose another bright color. And then I could time remap this so I can isolate just those 60 frames that I want. So maybe go from 0 to 2 seconds and maybe let's give it another extra 10 frames. Press Control-Alt-T or Command-Option-T on a Mac to enable time remapping. Click on the Add Keyframe button. I don't need this last one right here, but now I have these keyframes that represent the start and end of the animation, and I could retime this if I wanted to, and After Effects will handle that just fine. So now if I wanted this to go faster, that will play back faster. Now, I don't necessarily need to do that, but with those keyframes where they originally were, I could add a quick expression to this property, Alt or Option click on it and say loop in plus loop out. And then after that parentheses, say minus value with a semicolon at the end. And this simple expression is going to infinitely loop that sequence of keyframes in both directions. So I can move these keyframes around wherever I want, and it's always gonna loop in both directions. So now I could say duplicate this, move it up, and maybe move it over, and then press U to bring up the keyframes and offset it forward in time, maybe 10 frames. I'll hold Alt, Shift, and press the right arrow key, and then I'll duplicate it again, press U, shift that forward in time again, another 10 frames, and this time move it over here. And then I could duplicate both of these layers, bring them to the top, drag them down visually to the bottom of the comp, press U to bring up those keyframes, shift them and forward in time 20 more frames, and now I've got all of these copies of this one instance of Cinema 4D, and if I set my work area to those keyframes and back it off one frame from that second one, so I'm looking at these ones right here, it's going to infinitely loop because of that expression that I set up. It's all very dynamic and easy to update. Now, I realize that was a lot to cover in one tutorial, especially if you've never used Cinema 4D before, but I wanted to give you some perspective on how you could achieve this effect with different techniques, whether you need to stay in After Effects or you have the luxury of jumping into another piece of software to create something that you just couldn't inside of After Effects. If you create anything using this technique, please tag me at JakeInMotion on Instagram or Twitter or anywhere you can find me online. I would love to see it and share it with everyone. I love getting tagged in those posts and seeing your work. If you ever have any questions, don't hesitate to leave a comment. Let me know what you thought of this tutorial. If you have any ideas for tutorials in the future, or if you have any questions about After Effects that you just aren't figuring out, I'd love to hear about it and add it to my list of running tutorial ideas. Make sure to give a thumbs up on this video if you enjoyed it, if you learned something from it, and subscribe so that you're not gonna miss out on any other future content from me, and you'll always be up to date with what I'm creating. Thanks to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.